It began with whispers that should never have left the walls of a home. A mother figure, trusted to nurture and protect, instead found herself entangled in a secret so dark it would end in betrayal, blood, and a cold grave. In the sleepy edges of an American suburb, where cul-de-sacs curve into silence and neighbors wave politely over picket fences, the walls of one modest house concealed a relationship that defied every boundary. A stepmother, her teenage stepson. What began as stolen glances and late-night conversations grew into a secret affair, a forbidden love born out of manipulation, secrecy, and desire. No one in the community suspected a thing. To outsiders, the family looked ordinary enough. A hard-working father, a woman who had slipped comfortably into the role of stepmom, and a teenage boy navigating the awkward years between childhood and manhood. But inside that house, trust was splintering. Lines were being crossed, and the kind of intimacy that should have been nurturing turned into something dangerous. There are moments in every crime story that feel almost cinematic, moments when the truth seems too disturbing to be real. This is one of them, because the affair between the stepmother and her teenage stepson wasn't just a secret. It was a fuse, and once lit, it burned straight toward an ending so violent, so cold-blooded, that it shocked not only the family at the center of it, but an entire community who had thought they knew them. Imagine this: a young man, barely out of his teens, torn between loyalty to his father and obsession with the woman who was supposed to be his second mother. A woman caught between fear of exposure and the intoxicating hold she had over her stepson, and a husband who remained oblivious until it was too late. When law enforcement finally pieced together what had happened, the story spilled into headlines. Lurid, shocking, drenched in betrayal. But the facts were even darker than the tabloids made them seem. This wasn't just a story of infidelity. It was a descent into obsession, manipulation, and ultimately murder. Tonight, we unravel the case of the stepmother's secret love affair with her teenage son that ended in cold-blooded murder. It is a case that forces us to ask hard questions. How does trust decay into betrayal? How does desire morph into destruction? And how does a family implode from the inside out, leaving behind nothing but horror? If you think you've heard it all when it comes to forbidden love and shocking crimes, think again. Because this story doesn't just cross a line, it obliterates it. And the echoes of that decision, made in secret behind closed doors, would reverberate in a way no one in that quiet neighborhood could have ever predicted. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, I'd like to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see how far these stories travel, how many of us are drawn into mysteries that seem stranger than fiction. And tell me this, when you first hear about a crime like this, a stepmother, a teenage son, an affair that spirals into murder, what's your gut reaction? Do you believe it's pure manipulation? Or is there a darker psychological bond at play? Your theories matter, and they help keep these cases alive. If stories like this one captivate you as much as they do me, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more of these dark, unforgettable cases to light, stories that should never be forgotten. On the surface, the family looked ordinary. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where kids rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, where the biggest scandal was usually a property dispute or a barking dog. The house itself was nothing remarkable. A split level with a neatly trimmed lawn, a basketball hoop in the driveway, and curtains that always seemed drawn a little too tightly. Inside, though, the atmosphere was different. The husband, a man in his early 40s, worked long hours. He carried himself with the weary but determined air of someone who had shouldered responsibility for most of his life. He had been through a divorce, and raising his teenage son alone had not been easy. When he remarried, he believed he had finally found stability, a woman who could help mend the edges of a fractured home. She was younger than him, attractive in a way that drew attention, though she often cloaked herself in modesty when neighbors were around. To friends, she seemed attentive, even doting, as though eager to prove she could step into the role of mother. She attended school functions, baked cookies for the PTA, and smiled in church pews. But behind that practiced image, her relationship with her stepson was taking shape in ways no one imagined. The teenage boy, let's call him Daniel, was at that vulnerable crossroads of adolescence. Tall, with the awkward build of a young man, not quite filled out, he carried the weight of his parents' divorce like a stone in his pocket. He loved his father, but their relationship was strained. His dad's long hours at work left gaps of absence that were filled by silence and, eventually, by someone else's voice. That voice was his stepmother's. At first, their conversations were harmless. She asked about his day, about school, about the friends he kept or didn't keep. She listened when his father was too busy or too tired. And slowly, she became the person he turned to with his secrets. But what began as comfort blurred into something else. And slowly, she became the person he turned to with his secrets. But what began as comfort blurred into something else. Those who study cases like this point out how fragile the line is between attention and manipulation, especially for teenagers whose identities are still forming. A compliment here, a touch on the shoulder there, lingering eye contact. These are subtle, but in the isolation of a home, they take on weight. To Daniel, her attention felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. To her, perhaps, it was a dangerous thrill. Neighbors would later recall seeing them together in ways that seemed too close, though no one said anything at the time. One neighbor remembered catching sight of them in the backyard late at night, laughing in low voices while the father was away on a business trip. Another recalled how she seemed to hover at Daniel's side during family gatherings, as though they shared a private joke no one else understood. And then came the turning point. According to reports pieced together later, the stepmother began confiding in Daniel, not just listening, but sharing. She spoke of her loneliness, her dissatisfaction, her frustrations with his father. She cast herself as misunderstood, neglected, and quietly suffering. And in doing so, she tightened the bond between them, pulling Daniel not only closer but into complicity. It's impossible to know the exact moment the line was crossed, when maternal role shifted into a secret affair. But by the time it did, Daniel was already emotionally entangled. For a teenage boy desperate for connection, the affection of someone he trusted was intoxicating. And for her, the power of being desired, of holding sway over youth and innocence, proved irresistible. The secrecy became a ritual, whispered conversations in hallways, furtive touches when no one was looking, stolen hours when a father was away. Each act deepened the web of deception, and each act pushed them closer to a breaking point. In communities like theirs, the facade of family perfection often masks darker truths. People don't want to believe such betrayals can happen behind closed doors. And so the signs, the slightly too long embrace, the unexplained tension at the dinner table, went unnoticed. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Daniel was changing. Friends noticed he became withdrawn, secretive, almost paranoid. His grades slipped. He spent less time outside, less time with friends. He carried himself with a restless energy, as though constantly waiting for something to happen. His stepmother, too, began to show signs of strain. She grew more defensive, more protective of her time, and, at times, almost reckless in her affection. The father, the man who had trusted this woman with his home and his son, saw only fragments of the truth. He attributed Daniel's mood swings to typical teenage rebellion. He explained away his wife's distance as stress or exhaustion. He was blind to the undercurrents that were about to pull him under. Every forbidden relationship carries within it the seeds of destruction. And in this case, destruction would come with a vengeance. For as much as they tried to keep their secret, as much as they built their own private world within the walls of that house, reality could not be kept out forever. Pressure was mounting. The affair couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. Rumors stirred. Glances from neighbors lasted a little too long. Even family friends began to wonder at the closeness they observed. And with pressure comes panic. With panic comes desperate choices. And desperate choices, as history has shown time and again, often end in blood. The night it happened was unremarkable at first glance, the kind of evening where routine dulls the edges of awareness. The father was home, exhausted from work, stretched across the living room recliner. A muted television flickered against his half-closed eyes, the sound barely audible. The house smelled faintly of dinner, reheated leftovers, a plate still on the counter. Upstairs, Daniel sat in his room, headphones resting loosely around his neck, but no music playing. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, exactly, only that something felt inevitable. His stepmother moved through the house with the restless energy of someone hiding too much. She lingered in hallways, checked on Daniel without reason, her eyes darting toward the recliner where her husband dozed. She was pacing the thin line between secrecy and exposure, and she knew it. Every shared glance with Daniel felt loaded, every moment electric with the risk of being caught. Later, investigators would try to pinpoint what triggered the violence that night. Was it an argument? A discovery? A threat of exposure? What they learned suggested it was all three. According to Daniel's testimony, the night began with raised voices. His father, perhaps more alert than usual, had noticed something. A look, a whisper, a detail out of place, enough to sharpen suspicion. Confrontations in families are rarely clean. They come jagged, layered with years of unspoken grievances. The father accused his wife of being distant, distracted. She snapped back, defensive. And somewhere in the exchange, Daniel's name surfaced. The air in the room shifted instantly. The father's suspicion, until then vague and formless, latched onto something concrete. Why was Daniel so withdrawn lately? Why had his wife been so protective of him? Why had whispers around town hinted at something not quite right? Denial might have saved them in that moment. But instead, the stepmother faltered. Her defensiveness sharpened into panic, her words tripping over themselves. And in that pause, in that crack of silence, Daniel understood. The secret was no longer safe. For a teenage boy caught between two worlds, loyalty to his father and obsession with his stepmother, the choice should have been simple. But desire clouds reason. Manipulation twists logic. And in that moment, with his father's anger rising and his stepmother's fear pulling at him, Daniel chose blood. The fight escalated quickly. Voices turned into shouts, shouts into threats. A chair overturned, the thud of wood against carpet. The father demanding answers, the stepmother screaming denials. And then Daniel moved. The weapon was not planned, not in the way people imagine. It wasn't a gun hidden away or a knife laid out in advance. It was whatever was closest, whatever his hand could grasp in the heat of panic. A kitchen knife, pulled from the counter, blade glinting in the dull light of the living room. Neighbors later reported hearing a crash, glass shattering, a scream cut short. One described it as the sound of an animal caught in a trap. Another said the shouting stopped so suddenly it was eerie, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the house. The details of what followed were pieced together from blood patterns, forensic reconstruction, and, later, Daniel's confession. His father fought. He tried to push back, tried to wrestle the knife away. But Daniel was fueled by adrenaline, by fear, by the desperate pull of the woman urging him on. Each stab cut not only into flesh, but into the fragile illusion of family that had barely held them together. By the time it ended, the living room was silent again. The television flickered on, casting ghostly light over the scene. The recliner had toppled, the carpet soaked dark. The father lay motionless, his body crumpled at the foot of the stairs. The knife, slippery with blood, clattered from Daniel's hand. And then there was only breathing. Heavy, ragged, panicked. The stepmother, eyes wide, hands trembling. Daniel, chest heaving, staring at what he had done. There's a moment after violence when time seems suspended, when those involved realize the enormity of what has happened but can't yet process it. That was the silence that filled the room. The stepmother was the first to move. She touched Daniel's shoulder, whispered something, words lost to the chaos of memory, but later described as soothing, as if she were comforting rather than condemning. In that moment, she bound him even tighter to her, shifting from co-conspirator to protector. Together, They stood over the body of the man who had once been husband and father. But murder doesn't stay hidden for long. Blood leaves traces. Neighbors notice absences. Stories unravel under scrutiny. And they knew it, so they moved quickly. They dragged the body toward the garage, leaving a trail investigators would later map inch by inch. They fumbled with garbage bags, towels, anything to contain a mess. Their plan, if it could be called one, was frantic, driven by fear rather than logic. At one point, Daniel broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. His stepmother hushed him, urging him to stay strong. She told him they would figure it out. They would make it disappear. But you cannot make murder disappear. You can only delay its discovery. By dawn, the father's car was missing from the driveway. Neighbors assumed he had left early for work. The stepmother greeted them with a hollow smile when they waved. Daniel stayed inside, curtains drawn. But behind the facade, panic was clawing at them. The body was hidden poorly. Forensics would later describe it as amateurish, almost childlike, the desperate attempt of two people in way over their heads. They hadn't thought of decomposition, of the smell, of the inevitability of discovery. They only thought of buying time. Time, however, was not on their side. Within days, co-workers began asking questions. Why hadn't he shown up for shifts? Why wasn't he answering calls? Friends reached out, left messages that went unanswered. Suspicion grew. When police eventually knocked on the door, the stepmother answered with practiced calm. She spun a story of her husband leaving suddenly, perhaps after an argument. She suggested stress, the weight of work, maybe even the desire to get away. She painted him as troubled, evasive, almost unreliable. But beneath the veneer, cracks showed. Officers noted her shaking hands, her contradictory details. The real unraveling came not from her, but from Daniel. Teenagers are rarely adept at sustaining lies under pressure. Interrogators picked up on his unease immediately. The darting eyes, the pauses too long, the details too rehearsed. And when presented with fragments of evidence, the bloodstains they missed, the trail leading to the garage, his story began to crumble. What investigators uncovered in that house would later be described as one of the most disturbing domestic crime scenes they had encountered. Not because of its brutality alone, but because of the twisted intimacy that led to it. A son killing his father under the influence of his stepmother. A betrayal so profound it rattled even seasoned detectives. The crime was no longer just about murder. It was about the forbidden bond that fueled it, the manipulation that steered it, and the cold-blooded choices made in the aftermath. The investigation began, as so many do, with a missing person report that didn't quite add up. When the father failed to show up for work 3 days in a row, his employer called the house. The stepmother answered each time with excuses. He was unwell, he'd stepped out, he was dealing with personal matters. But by the third day, her explanations faltered. Her voice trembled, her stories contradicted. Concern turned into suspicion. Soon, friends, co-workers, and eventually local authorities were all asking the same question. Where was he? Police first approached the case cautiously. Men walk away from families. Men disappear for days. Sometimes it's stress, sometimes infidelity, sometimes midlife rebellion. But as officers spoke with neighbors and friends, the puzzle pieces didn't fit that narrative. He was steady, reliable. A man who didn't skip shifts, who didn't vanish without notice. His absence was not a choice. It was a rupture. The stepmother's demeanor set off alarms almost immediately. Officers who interviewed her described her as performing grief. She cried without tears. Her answers circled back on themselves. She volunteered details no one had asked for, as if anticipating suspicion. Her story, that her husband had stormed out after an argument, sounded rehearsed, brittle at the edges. And then there was Daniel. Detectives noticed the boy's nervousness, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap, the way his eyes darted toward his stepmother before answering even the simplest questions. Teenagers can be awkward around authority, but this was something different. His tension was palpable, as though he was carrying a secret too heavy for his frame. What the investigators didn't know yet, but would soon learn, was that Daniel's silence wasn't loyalty. It was fear. The first break came with forensics. A neighbor had reported seeing the garage light on late into the night, unusual for the family. Officers requested entry to the home under the pretext of a welfare check. What they found raised eyebrows, faint streaks on the floor near the garage, hastily wiped but not erased. A luminol test revealed what the eye could not deny: blood, and a lot of it. Once the possibility of foul play was established, the house transformed into a crime scene. Detectives combed through every room, photographing, bagging, tagging. They found fibers inconsistent with normal wear. They found cleaning supplies out of place, bottles half-used, sponges reeking of bleach. Most chillingly, they found traces of blood in the living room, spattered in patterns that told a silent story of violence. And then came the moment that shifted the case. Faced with the weight of evidence and the relentless pressure of questioning, Daniel confessed. His words spilled out in halting sobs, describing the fight, the knife, the body dragged across the carpet. He painted himself as panicked, manipulated, cornered. But in his confession, another detail emerged, one that turned the case from shocking to grotesque. He spoke of his stepmother's role, of how she had whispered to him in the aftermath, urging him to stay strong, of how their relationship was not what it seemed. The detectives, hardened by years of crime, felt their stomachs churn as the story unfolded. This wasn't just murder. This was incest, betrayal, corruption of a family unit at its core. Investigators pivoted. The focus shifted to the stepmother, no longer just a grieving wife, but a possible co-conspirator, manipulator, seducer. They confronted her with Daniel's statements. At first, she denied everything. She called him confused, unstable. But when evidence of the affair surfaced, text messages, handwritten notes hidden in his room, her denials collapsed. The community reeled as details leaked. Headlines screamed with lurid fascination: "Stepmother's affair with teenage son leads to murder." Neighbors who once waved across fences now stared in disbelief at the house swarming with police cars. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Churches held sermons about morality, betrayal, sin. The quiet neighborhood had become the stage for a nightmare. Forensics sealed the case. The blood spatter analysis confirmed the father had been attacked in the living room, not outside as the stepmother initially claimed. The drag marks to the garage matched Daniel's account. DNA tests linked the blood-soaked knife to the father. Every thread of evidence wove the same damning story. Husband murdered, wife complicit, son transformed into killer. In court documents later released, investigators described the stepmother's influence over Daniel as predatory. She had cultivated dependence, blurred boundaries, and ultimately weaponized his loyalty against his father. Whether she orchestrated the killing outright or simply allowed it to happen under her manipulative influence remained a matter of legal debate. But in the eyes of many, her guilt was clear. Detectives who worked the case admitted privately that it haunted them. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the psychology behind it, the perversion of trust, the corruption of roles meant to protect. To them, it wasn't just a murder investigation. It was an autopsy of a family destroyed from within. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to present not only the evidence of murder, but the sordid details of the affair. They understood the power of narrative, that a jury, like a community, would not only weigh facts, but recoil from the taboo at the center of it. It was not just patricide. It was a forbidden relationship that had exploded into bloodshed. The investigation had done its work. The truth, as horrifying as it was, lay bare. But justice was still to come. The trial that followed was less about what had happened and more about why. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood patterns, confessions, text messages, neighbors' testimonies, all threads weaving into a tapestry of guilt. But behind the facts, the courtroom buzzed with a darker fascination, the forbidden relationship that had ignited it all. When Daniel entered the courtroom for the first time, shackled and pale, the gallery gasped. He looked younger than his years, fragile, almost childlike in the oversized prison uniform. To some, he was a victim, groomed, manipulated, pushed into a corner by an adult who blurred every boundary. To others, he was a murderer, fully aware of the knife in his hand and the blood it spilled. The stepmother, by contrast, carried herself with defiance. Dressed carefully, her hair pulled back, she projected composure. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel occasionally, but mostly she stared straight ahead, her jaw set. Prosecutors painted her as a manipulative predator, a woman who had seduced a vulnerable boy and then used him as a weapon to remove her husband. Her defense team countered with a different portrait. A lonely wife trapped in a loveless marriage, vilified by gossip, and now scapegoated by a panicked teenager who alone wielded the knife. The courtroom became theater. Jurors leaned forward as the prosecution read excerpts from the secret notes Daniel and his stepmother had exchanged. Simple phrases, "I need you, you're the only one who understands me," took on monstrous weight under fluorescent lights. Forensic experts described blood spatter arcs with clinical detachment, their words punctuated by projected images of the crime scene that made spectators avert their eyes. Daniel himself took the stand, his voice trembling. He admitted to killing his father, but insisted he had acted under the influence of his stepmother. He described the whispered promises, the emotional grip she had over him. "She told me we'd be together," he said through tears. "She said this was the only way." His testimony left the room in stunned silence. The defense attempted to dismantle his credibility, portraying him as unstable, prone to fantasy, desperate for attention. But the prosecution pressed back with evidence too heavy to ignore: the notes, the timing, the forensic trail that matched his account. Public reaction was swift and vicious. Newspapers splashed lurid headlines across front pages. Talk shows debated whether Daniel was a victim or villain. Social media, relentless in its judgment, branded the stepmother everything from seductress to monster. Community members who had once waved at her in grocery aisles now spat her name with venom. The jury deliberated for days, weighed down by the gravity of the decision. In the end, the verdicts were clear. Daniel was found guilty of second-degree murder, his youth and manipulation acknowledged, but not excusing the act. His stepmother was found guilty of conspiracy and sexual abuse. Her role in grooming and coercion lay bare for all to see. The sentences were heavy. Daniel received decades in prison, his adolescence traded for concrete walls and barbed wire. The stepmother's sentence was nearly as long, ensuring she would leave prison an old woman, if at all. As the judge read the sentences, the courtroom was silent, the air thick with the weight of tragedy. For the father's family, there was no victory. Justice, perhaps, but never healing. His siblings wept quietly in the gallery, clutching photographs of a man described as steady, hard-working, undeserving of such an end. His parents, too frail to attend every day of the trial, spoke through letters read aloud in court. Words trembling with grief, with disbelief at how the family they had built was torn apart from within. The community carried scars as well. For months, whispers lingered at church gatherings, at supermarket aisles, at school functions. Parents cast suspicious eyes toward step-parents, trust fractured in ways subtle but lasting. The house itself, where everything had unraveled, became a local symbol of horror. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid it. Others drove by slowly, staring, as if trying to reconcile the familiar sighting with the monstrous axe inside. In prison, Daniel reportedly struggled. Guard described him as withdrawn, haunted, replaying the night over and over. He received therapy, though progress was slow. Letters from sympathizers trickled in, some calling him a victim of abuse, others condemning him as beyond redemption. He read them all, but responded to none. His stepmother, meanwhile, adapted quickly to incarceration, maintaining her defiance. She refused interviews, refused to admit guilt, and clung to the narrative that she was scapegoated. Years later, journalists would revisit the case, publishing retrospectives that re-examined the psychology behind it. Was Daniel truly manipulated, or had he been a willing participant in an affair that spiraled out of control? Was the stepmother a predator, Or was she also broken in ways that warped her judgment? Experts debated, but no consensus emerged. What remained undeniable was the body in the ground, the blood on the carpet, and the family destroyed beyond repair. The aftermath lingered not only in courts and prisons, but in the imagination of those who followed it. For many, it became a cautionary tale of trust betrayed, of boundaries ignored, of how quickly desire can metastasize into violence. For others, it was a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it grows inside a home, behind curtains drawn too tightly. Some stories fade as time passes. This one refuses. It clings to the imagination because it violates something deep within us. The expectation that home should be a sanctuary, that family is sacred, that trust is unbreakable. The case of the stepmother's secret affair with her teenage stepson, ending in cold-blooded murder, strips those assumptions bare. It asks us to confront uncomfortable truths, that betrayal does not always come from strangers, that manipulation can grow where love should, that sometimes the person we rely on most is the one who leads us to destruction. For Daniel, the boy who became a killer, the tragedy is twofold. He lost his father, not to natural causes or fate, but by his own hand. He also lost himself, his youth, his freedom, his future. In chasing the warped affection of someone who should have protected him, he destroyed the very bond he longed for. His punishment is not just prison walls, but the echo of his choices, playing endlessly in the silence of his cell. For the stepmother, the tragedy is of another kind. She crossed a line that should never be crossed, turning intimacy into a weapon and desire into manipulation. Whether she believed she was in love or whether it was simply power and control, the outcome is the same: devastation. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, her face etched into headlines as a villain. She will live out her days marked not by the promise of a family, but by the shadow of a crime too monstrous to forget. And for the man at the center, the father whose life was taken, the tragedy is final. His trust was broken in the most brutal way possible by those who should have loved him most. He will never see his son grow, never grow old with his wife, never reclaim the peace he thought he had found in remarriage. His story ends in silence, in a pool of blood on his own living room floor. The community, too, carries the scars. Neighbors who once thought of their street as safe now look at it differently. Families who once waved across lawns now remember how little they knew of what went on behind closed doors. The echoes of this crime linger, reshaping how people trust, how they watch, how they whisper. In the end, this case reminds us that evil rarely arrives with warning signs blaring. Sometimes it grows in whispers, in subtle manipulations, in secrets carefully nurtured until they explode. It is chilling because it is not extraordinary, because it could happen anywhere, to anyone, in any quiet home where boundaries blur and silence protects the wrong people. Some crimes leave us unsettled long after the verdict is read. This is one of them. A stepmother, a teenage son, a secret affair, and a murder that shattered the illusion of family forever. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Daniel was truly a victim of manipulation? Or do you think he was fully aware of the choices he made that night? And what about the stepmother? Was she the mastermind or just as broken as the boy she entangled? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story unsettled you as much as it did me, make sure you hit the like button. It helps keep these cases alive, reminding the world of tragedies that should never be forgotten. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dark Case Files and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story we uncover. Because the darkest mysteries are often the ones hiding closest to home.